Hello.
Good morning, or, well, it's always morning somewhere.
It's always morning somewhere. It's very dark here. It's night. Everybody turned
Yeah,
off the lights.
it's so early, we still have to wait for the sun to go up.
Yes, it's too early.
Yes.
Wow, full Apollo meeting. It's a Apollo. Welcome to the Apollo working group.
Yeah. Might as well be another Tuesday morning. Tuesday morning for me, I guess. Yeah.
Can I talk to you about my Lord and Savior Apollo client, Kotlin?
Hello, friends.
Hey, how's it
Hey,
going?
hey, hey, hey.
Hello.
What do we have on the agenda?
We have a medium-sized agenda today. Um, Hopefully we get a full set of folks.
Hey, everybody.
Hello. All right, how many folks do we have? 9. Sweet. Number of attendees matches what is in the agenda file. So we're gonna start rolling. Nice t-shirt. Yeah, you got the conference t-shirt sporting today. My kids wear them as pajamas. I got a bonus one. And every time I come home from any conference, they always want to take the t-shirts and wear them as pajamas. That's what happened to mine. All right, friends, let's get things rolling. Thanks for being here. It's hard to believe it's November already. What happened to this year? It's just evaporating. Of course, by being here, we all agree to the spec membership agreement, participation guidelines, contribution guide, code of conduct. And as a reminder, as I'm sure Zoom already reminded everybody, um, these are recorded. We both use some AI summarization tools to help us with notes, and then also these get published to YouTube. Hello, YouTube. Um, as we always do, let's start with a quick round the room names to faces, and then we'll go into our agenda. We'll go through in the list order in the agenda file, and I'm on top. So, hello, everybody. My name is Lee.
Hi, I'm Lens, Apollo client.
Hi, I'm Jeanette from Meta.
Martin from Apollo.
Hi, Rob from First Dibs. Hey, I'm Jeff from Apollo.
Hi, Benoit from Apollo.
I'm Gerald from Apollo.
Hey folks, I'm Benji from GraphQL.
All
I'm
right.
Matt from Meta.
Hey, Matt, add yourself to the agenda.
I did.
Oh,
You
you
need to
did.
refresh.
All right, I'm reloading. Reloading. All right, indeed you did. Okay. Thanks for making it happen. Um, all right, friends. Thanks for the names to faces. Quick run through of the agenda. I don't believe we did secondary meeting this time around, so we don't have anything to review there. I'm going to give a quick update on TSC elections. I'm actually going to discuss shifting the timescale of those, so I'd love a quick discussion, but otherwise we'll just keep going with that. And then we have a handful of interesting things going on, some grants available. We'll talk about object identification, um, updating descriptions of fragments, and then we'll talk about release trains and capabilities, and then some defer and stream updates. Is there anything not on this list that anyone wants to talk about today? To make sure we get time to talk about it. All right, let's jump into things. Right here on the top of our list is TSC elections. I think I automatically inserted these agenda items far into the future to remind ourselves that these happen. What has happened historically is that November, December, because there's a bunch of holidays and things, they tend to move very slowly, and then we end up picking steam back up at the beginning of the year. And the last batch of TSC additions, we decided to set their term end to be the end of January rather than the end of December. So we need to update the rest of our election date cycle. TSC nominations are essentially kind of open all the time. Anyone can always put themselves on that list, and we'll just sort of call for the close of nominations when the vote comes. But I was going to suggest A, narrowing this from like a multi-month process into a much shorter timeline, and B, making it so that we kick off votes in January. So rather than kicking off votes in December, which basically gives us a little bit more time to do nominations because it'll give us this meeting. We'll do some announcements. We'll do December meeting as well. Continue to hold nominations. And then January 1st, we'll open the vote and we'll probably close it pretty quickly. Our votes tend to go fairly quickly. So that's a slight shift in the timeline as we've done in the past. Actually, probably closer to the timeline that we've done in the past, but it's a slight shift from the timeline that we've written down on paper. I'm curious if anyone has feedback or thoughts or opinions on this. Cool. Yeah, exactly, Benji. Make it so the key dates are not over winter break. That is the plan. And historically, that is where we have slid from the schedule as we've written it. Okay, since we've got a mix of silence and thumbs ups in the reactions, we'll call that the plan, which means officially nominations have opened. So if you are not on the TSC and you're interested in serving on the TSC, you will find a link there. It has some outdated copy at the top, but I will fix that. Basically, just sticks your name into a Google sheet that we can see, and it'll feed into our elections process. Over the course of the next handful of weeks, we should just make some noise if there's folks that are in the community who would be interested in this. Make sure that they're aware that the nominations are open. We'll post on some other platforms, and we'll remind folks next meeting as well. And then come January, we will close nominations and we'll start the vote. And yes, we will update the TSC charter, which is, I will drop a quick link. This is the file that has all of our process for how TSCs work, how we do the votes, what they're accountable for, etc. So if you have any other questions about TSCing, that is a good resource. Okay, that's all I have to say on TSC for now. Grants, Benji, I'll hand it to you actually to talk about grants.
Okay, this is just a general reminder that we have a grants process. That's not the word I was looking for. Project? No, program. We have a grants program available. So anyone who is doing work on any of the foundation projects, whether that be the specifications, the implementations, or the documentation, basically anything that's under github.com/GraphQL. If any financial help would help you with this, then please do apply. And I would also, in particular, encourage you to apply now, because as you may notice, we're coming up for the end of the year, and at that point, the budget will reset, and we do not roll it over. So we have budget available. If it will help, please submit your application and let's get whatever feature it is that you want to get added to GraphQL Advanced.
And we were talking this morning about some priorities for community grants. Obviously, a big theme coming out of the last conference was ways in which GraphQL and AI overlap, and we got our new working group set up. And perhaps unsurprisingly, one of the things we're going to do in updating our priorities and examples on the community grant is anything that lives in that space, anything that we can do to make GraphQL tooling interop with the AI tooling. That's going to be a prime candidate for getting approved for community grants. Okay, Lens, we'll hand it to you for object identification.
Oh yeah, I've done some research, so I'm sorry for the older ones among us. Like this has probably come up every year for the last 10 years or so. Um, I'm I want to start this proposal from a client perspective. Like our perspective here is the perspective of a client that has no schema knowledge. And right now, for us and our user, it's very complicated and it means foot gun to identify things to normalize them. There's like we can't like automatically inject an ID field into queries because we don't have schema knowledge. We don't know if it exists. We can't really have like there are a few linting tools to help with that process. Like you shouldn't forget it. You should always edit yourself. But it's a ton of work to set up, and people oftentimes don't know that they need to set things like that up. There might be schemas where a field named ID just doesn't exist or isn't unique. So you need to start setting up your own key field overrides. And at the end of the day, you have very complex configuration logic that will always run behind your schema. So the idea behind this proposal is to add two things. One thing is like from my perspective as the maintainer of a runtime client with no schema knowledge, and that's that every schema should have an __ ID field that can always be queried, with a constraint that this field either always returns something unique for a type name, or for type names that just can't be normalized or where it's not easy to calculate, always returns null. But never like a mix, like sometimes it returns something, sometimes it doesn't. Yes, Matt?
Is the idea here to just scope it to unique per type name? Because
Yes.
kind of sort of have that with the node specification, or I guess node is different. There's a broader problem of how do you do a global cache when the IDs from the server are not unique globally.
Yeah. So the idea here is to do it unique per type name with two different reasonings behind that. One is that we always inject __ type name into all queries and fragments anyways. And many servers just go ahead and concatenate those. So you would send over the type name twice instead of once. Once as a type name on its own, once as part of the ID. And the other thing is like the moment you enter like multiple servers that are stitched together, federation and stuff, not every server might know that it has something that is unique to the global graph because maybe a server has control over most of a type name, but not over everything else in the schema. So the idea here is that the combination of type name and ID would always be unique, but not necessarily the ID on its own would be unique. And the problem with the existing node specification is that as a client, we just don't know if the server adheres to it. There's no guarantee at all. So we do a best guess. If we see underscore ID, we take that. If we see ID, we take that. But we've seen a lot of cases where people have a field called ID and it's actually not even unique per type name. And then things get merged together in the cache and it ends up being an absolute chaos. So we would need something that's not just like accidentally popping out of a database, but actually not unique because it might be part of a composite key or something, but something where the server would need to like opt into supporting this. The strategy behind it is like if the server doesn't support it, we query for it, we get null returned, and we either assume like it's not normalizable or the server just doesn't support it and the user has to like bring their own. But if it's there, we would have like the first time in history the option to make an assumption. That proposal has a second half to it, and that's an underscore underscore entity. And that would be, on the other hand, for clients that have a build step to identify if a field or a type name actually has a resolver for the underscore underscore ID field, so it can make a decision based on that and can assume that it will be there at runtime and not null. That's like the second half to this. I'm trying to read chat here.
Oh, entity. I'm trying to understand the second part. The idea with entity is to be able to mark particular types as they will always have that ID. So any object in GraphQL might have a dunder ID, but an entity will always have a dunder ID. Is that the idea?
I think
The idea with under ID is that it's always there, but sometimes it returns always null, sometimes it returns always string. The idea
Right.
with under entity is that if you don't make a request to the server, but you have the schema available, you will already know if a string will come back or not, and if you can like use that to normalize things. So that's more for the build time, but I think Martin can say more about that use case.
Like entities.
If I didn't already sum it up, but the idea came from the Kotlin direction, I think, that you wanted to have something in it to identify on build time.
Oh yes, no, for sure. If there is going to be one, yes, 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 that's a goal.
so.
Um,
I would propose that you mark the type itself explicitly in the SDL, and I think that's what you're trying to do with this interface. But the interface doesn't, for example, indicate that things that don't implement that interface will always return ID null. So I would go with an alternative thing, whether it be a directive or an extra keyword. I suggested in the chat that we have something like identified type object or type object identified or some extra keyword there that says this is an identified type and anything else is not. And that way, you know, if it's got identified, ID will always be non-null. And if it doesn't have that, ID will always be, dunder ID will always be null.
Yeah, that would be one possible way of doing it in GraphQL JS. I didn't want to like make a strong assumption how a server would do it. And the thing is like usually these underscore underscore fields don't show up in introspected schemas. So I didn't want to take that part like suddenly we have underscore underscore ID everywhere in the schema and thought of a different way of doing that. But generally I'm open. If if these suddenly pop up, I'm perfectly fine with that too. The big thing is for me, like we can always just query for it, and we never get a GraphQL error from the server if we query for it, because that's right now why we can't just inject ID.
Can I ask some pointed questions to help understand some of this a little bit more? I'm curious what value is lost if we didn't have this entity interface, or if we didn't have the ability to say that a dunder ID will not be null.
Like like if you assume that a server completely uses this and implements this, it would make it possible for a client to decide at build time if it can normalize certain objects or if they need to be stored as children of their parent or referenced of the last ID of a parent that was available or something like that.
Oh, I
So
see.
this is
Okay.
it's just a signal that's available at build time, where a client like Apollo client that's only runtime available could not make this choice based on the build time, but only based on the result it would get from a server. Like this is just like two sides to the medal. How exactly they look like is another thing, but we just have these two scenarios and we need to feed both of them.
I see. Okay. So it's in the runtime environment, you don't want to have to rely on the types. And so you use the value of this to know whether you can put it into a cache. And in the at build time, you do have the types. And knowing that all instances of a particular type will certainly have this field means that you can do a fast path or something like that.
Yes,
Okay, that makes sense.
exactly.
Um, One thought I was just thinking through, this is not the first time that we've brought up um, this idea, and I think the main reason why the last one didn't really work is the ID concept had gotten quite overloaded, and different people were thinking about ID as representing different things. Like it could represent the domain identifier for an object. It could represent the refetch token, right? Like if I want to, I have some object and I need to go back to the API and refetch it again. So this, I think one of the original ones that probably came out of Facebook Meta was tying it to the node interface, which had this sort of like generalizable refetching property. And then there's this third one, which is I think what you all are pointing at, which is treating it like a cache key, right? You can know for certain that these two things are represent the same concept, and so one can cache replace the other. Um, I think it might be helpful to just firmly pick the last one. Like this is for caching. That's what it's for. Or more specifically, it's for like um, non-domain identifying of objects. Because it'll help us avoid the scenarios where we overload it. And there's certainly nothing wrong with having both a double underscore ID field and then also a regular ID field, especially if they might end up being slightly different from one another for certain reasons. The other thought was that if we're going to introduce a new thing, it might be helpful to introduce it with as strong of guarantees as possible. In particular, making its describing that it must always have a globally unique value would be extremely helpful for building caches. And if you are then implementing this and you realize, oh, I don't have the enough data to guarantee that this is going to be globally unique, then you can use the trick of doing some string concat or something. And like, I take the name of the type plus whatever value I have, and now I have something that's reasonably globally unique. Rather than saying this double score ID field will only be unique within the scope of a particular type, because now just getting the ID field alone doesn't necessarily give you enough information to start building caches, because you also have to get the type name field in order to now be able to represent a globally unique cache. And I'm also thinking of if we had this property, then not only can we build client-side caches, we could also start to build different transport mechanisms. Like we could build a graph mode transport where if you see the same object multiple time in a response, rather than building multiple copies of it, you could just build referential links to it. So that's like, I don't want to combine the things together, but that would be a very interesting thing for us to explore, but I think would only be possible if this gave us globally unique values, because otherwise that internal mechanism would be doing like additional overhead tracking. So
I'm
anyway, those are some
I'm
ideas, and I think,
I'm not opposed to that. My
yeah.
main concern is that it's just like double data over the network, because I believe that every client essentially always needs to query for type name to identify if certain fragments were matched and stuff like that.
No,
But I
no, you don't.
might be wrong there.
No, we're moving away from querying for type name wherever possible. And in fact, the representation, so we've internally built exactly this underscore ID or underscore ID mechanism. We called it strong. And we basically built that and immediately realized, one, strong is different from fetchable, which meant we then immediately built in a second one, because what you want for a value that you can put into the cache is something short and globally unique. So our type names can get quite long. Our type names can be like 30 to 60 characters long, depending on the type, because we're absurd. But so we don't want to request type name unless we really have to. And it turns out we actually never have to request type name. There's a way to structure the queries and structure your client-side generated code and metadata such that you never have to request type name, which cuts down a lot on response sizes. But if you don't send a globally unique ID, then you're still stuck requesting type name in order for cases where you don't know what the type name is going to be. So if you're in an interface or union, you still have to request type name. We're trying to cut that out because that is an additional load on our servers and on our responses. And like we don't want to deal with those. And additionally, we found, especially as we're adopting as we're getting like new customers of GraphQL, schema evolution gets really stuck if you are dependent on type name not changing. Yes, it is like a lot of people want to create an object, then upgrade that object to an interface. And if you are dependent on type name on the client, that becomes an impossible thing to do. Whereas if you're not, it's actually really easy. So basically, this is to say, it would be, if we're going to go down this route, we should try really hard to make sure that the solution we're coming out with is not dependent on type name, is going to give us the caching properties we want, and allows the servers to do smart things like hashing really long keys without introducing the possibility of like you're reusing this identifier to ask for something from the server that the server can't resolve because it doesn't know how to deal with this identifier. If it's just an ephemeral cache ID, like you can't get it back, even if there is a field that would let you get the thing back. Which is to say, yeah, this is very exciting. This is definitely needed, and we need best practices here, and we need to know, like, we need a way that clients can reliably depend on behavior. And what we've built internally is almost exactly this spec, and it's not good enough. It's nowhere near good enough. We've had to like build 3 versions of this in order to get all the things we need.
Matt, it would be
I mean,
helpful if you or
I'm
someone on
also
your team could brain dump some of the things that you've learned into the RFC thread.
Yeah, will do.
Yeah, like I'm also absolutely open if we have good reasons to make these globally unique. That would be a way. We could also think about changing it a little bit from a string to maybe an array of strings, which could hold more information for you and would have the additional value of if the server returns an empty array, it's not normalizable. If the server returns an array with strings in it, that's the key. And if the server returns null, it doesn't support this feature. That could be some kind of feature detection if we wanted to go away like that, like just spitballing. Like we just need something in the end. I'm absolutely not set on how exactly it looks like, but I really want to get this going. And I think we need to look at this from a caching and client perspective because that's what needs it right now. There might be other requirements that can come with other solutions or accidentally overlap.
Strongly agree. I think that's what has tripped us up in the past is trying to choose one thing that can serve many purposes. It's like both a cache key and it's an object identifier and it's also a refetch key. And in practice, systems are just more complicated than that and there's too many edge cases. So narrowing it just to specifically this is something that uniquely identifies this object for the purposes of putting it into a cache is great because if you change the ID of an object, like, I don't know, there's 1,000 things in your system that might break. But it might be totally reasonable to change the cache key of an object, where you say, like, our caching strategy has changed. We've abandoned this old client, whatever. Like, awesome, those could change. It would unlock the ability to do this, interesting new kind of like graph mode response format where we don't duplicate multiple references to the same object. And so I think there's a lot of really interesting properties that this could unlock. So I think I'm going to go ahead and mark this as RFC1 because clearly there's interest in continuing the idea. In terms of next steps, I think we need to be very crisp about what are the guarantees of this and then like bonus is like what are not the guarantees. So what would you expect from the system it correctly implemented? And it seems to me from hearing from you and from Matt, that list is probably something around this value is opaque. Like it would be probably wrong to say this is always some combination of type name and ID. It's like, no, this is just some opaque thing. And an implementer may choose to represent it however they like. The other is that it'll have stability over some window of time at least. And then probably the last one is this global uniqueness. Because if it's certainly at a minimum unique across the boundary of a request, right? Like no, if you see the same cache key twice in the same request payload, 100% sure that they are not the same object, which requires them to have that level of uniqueness. And ideally, they're also unique across a user session that may require like multiple back and forths. And best case scenario, you're globally unique across your entire system. And each of those unlocks the ability to do more things because you could imagine you're building some, intermediate internet layer cache tier that's trying to speed up GraphQL services. And if you have this global unique property and other things become solved, then you can use that for caching at that layer as well, which is also kind of interesting. So yeah, I think like narrowing that out will be quite helpful, and then also saying what you can't do with it will also be helpful. And then I think we'll have something reasonable. And then Matt, yeah, you should, especially if you've internally helped either build or watch people build multiple versions of this, spell out the reasons why the last ones failed so that we don't repeat them. Okay, awesome. Thank you, Lens, for bringing this one up. I'm excited to see how it develops. Jeanette, I'll hand things to you to talk about fragment descriptions.
Okay, yeah. So this is a pull request to update the description of fragments in the spec. So right now the spec says something like, look at your documents, like look for repeated fields and like throw them into a fragment, which is exactly not what we don't recommend. So the goal, I think, is to emphasize fragments should map to client logic components. Or yeah, as Benji pointed out, I think that word is a little tricky because we are client agnostic, but yeah, we can talk more about that. And then, yeah, I would like for it to emphasize the fact that fragments help with like evolving data needs more than sort of like, you look at what fields are common at the moment and you throw them into a fragment for convenience. So yes, I saw, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, do we want to talk about, I think since the latest update, I think Benji, you were the one who's left, I think, the most like feedback. So should we talk about it in person?
Sure. So I think well, first of all, this is like really important. Like this is incredibly important. And I see quite a lot of the time when I work with different clients that this is one of the biggest issues that people face with GraphQL. They are effectively building these big fragments that they keep adding to because they need a thing in one place or another, and the fragments grow forever. And it's partly because we think that the fragments are for reuse, and it's really the fragments are componentization of our data requirements, and this is so key. But even like in the Discord today, we saw some like, oh no, I'm not so keen on this because it's really hard to do and it's this, that, and the other. And it only took a little bit of discussion for them to realize, oh, actually, it is quite straightforward, and it does give you all these advantages. And I think one of the things that helps to lay that out is actually expanding the scenario a little bit and actually leading people through. So what I've done in my comment here is, and I wrote this up really quickly. This is not final text or anything, but I basically just led through the idea of starting with like a little small user avatar component, essentially, which I've called user card, and using the relay style naming with an underscore. So you've got user card as your function, user is your parameter to that function. So we have user card underscore user, and then we can compose that into the user profile component, which we might render on a hover, or we might render on the user profile page. And by showing them this layer, they can see how these functions would call each other, but also these fragments would essentially call each other in the same like mirrored way. And I think that there's a lot of value in effectively holding the reader's hand and leading them through this one scenario or a scenario like this, because then this is something that we can point people to time and time again and say, this is why fragments exist in GraphQL, and like this is the right way to do it. One particular question I have around this is the naming convention. And we have never mixed case like this before in the spec. We've never done like camel case mixed with an underscore in the same identifier. But I actually think that it adds a huge amount of clarity. Like this is why Relay does it, right? It separates the component or the element in the function in your code from the parameter name. And short of having a dot, which we don't have in identifiers, I think it's a good divider for that. So stylistically, I was also interested to hear what Lee felt about that.
My sense is that in the spec, we should be as terse as possible and keep things narrow. So I think keeping everything camel case, like not introducing conventions, like try to avoid naming conventions unless they're expected to be globally adopted, is probably the way. But all the things you're saying are quite useful, but I think the spec is probably not the right place for them. I was saying like I think this change is great. I'm happy to do like an editorial pass and then merge it. My sense of next steps is actually going to our documentation and making sure that the documentation for fragments mirrors a lot of this. And that's probably the space where there's more value in elaborating. Because here's where we should describe this is what the purpose of fragments for, and here's how they work. And we should use documentation to go deeper into the elaboration of like best practices for fragments and how to get the most out of them. So I think the changes made to the spec here are focused and narrow and small enough that this is just a net positive change. So I'm going to go ahead and with a little bit of editorial on top, merge this in. But Benji, hopefully that answers your question.
It does. But I will say that I disagree, and that I think that this should be in the spec, and that this is what we should be encouraging pretty much all GraphQL users to do. And I think we should be opinionated on this. I think over the last 10 years of GraphQL, we can see how many people who don't use Relay have made this mistake and the pain that has come out of it. And I think we really, really strongly should be encouraging a pattern like this. And the surfacing of something like an underscore user for the user prop, especially if we had a component or a function that accepted multiple things to demonstrate like why that is, I think would be really compelling to even just say, this is the way that we do it. And like, you can see it's in the spec. I agree that we should also have it in the documentation and that the documentation should go into a lot more depth on it. And I believe that we already do have that from some of our documentation work. But I actually really feel that this is so important to the success of GraphQL in general that we should actually have an opinion on it in the spec. And we're not saying you have to do this, but I think saying that this is the intent and this is why it exists is actually quite compelling.
I'd be open to putting something in like a non-normative note under there. That's like for like here's a naming convention people often use in a non-normative note. But yeah, I don't disagree. I think that is generally good practice, but I do want to be careful in the spec should be careful about best practice and focus on requirement. And I don't want to accidentally muddy the waters here of what is the requirement of using fragments. We introduced the new concepts and we explained why the concepts are getting introduced. And I think this change improves on that. But everything you're saying, I broadly agree with, and I think we'll probably just get more oomph from it from being in the primary docs anyhow. Okay, I'm gonna focus on getting this merged. Thank you, Jeanette, for bringing it up.
Yeah, I guess in terms of like minimal spec language, I guess Lee, if you want to figure out the best word for component, because I do agree with Benji, or I spent hours thinking about what that word should be. Logical unit, function, a list of things it could be. And I guess to Benji's point, I feel like, and we talked about this at the conference, there's like a value in having something like a client spec. And it's really hard right now in the server spec to talk about client issues because it's language agnostic and like we're not really talking about what logic on the client looks like. So yes, I agree with Benji that like some form of client spec one day would be great. But also Lee, to your point, I think for the spec as like the rest of it looks right now, like yeah, maybe more minimal makes sense. But yeah, if you could figure out a better word for component, feel free. This was the best I could do in my hour of typing random prompts into ChatGPT to see what would be most like universally comprehensible. Sorry, Matt, you had your hand up also.
Oh, sorry, I'm missing hands here. Go ahead, Matt.
I was just gonna be going back to Benji's point, like it might make sense if at the point where we want like, oh, this is why you should be using fragments in this specific way. What you're really asking for, I feel like, is like a set of motivating examples in the spec itself, which may or may not be where they belong, but like the motivation for why the spec is the way it is sort of a little bit separate from the spec itself, and maybe would need to be its own section.
I think Jeanette's changes do a pretty good job of, because we have a bunch of places where we show an example of how something gets used and framing this as rather than saying it's a mechanism for reuse, which to be fair to the change feels very dated. It's not the way people are using it. It's not for reuse. It's for composability. So reframing it from reuse to composability, I think, is like the right change. And then the example, I think, does a good job of saying, you know, here's a set of fields that are responsible for rendering a particular piece of UI, like a friend profile, and then like here's a query that renders friend profiles and like loads that data in two different places. So I think the example here makes sense and it succeeds at remaining terse. But Jeanette, you're right. That is the paragraph that I was gonna like spend hopefully under an hour. And if I decide that your version is the best, then I'll just merge it. But maybe I'll add one extra hour of brain power to see if I can't come up with anything better there.
I just want to mention that I feel like it's not so much composability that's really the key thing here. It's componentization of the data requirements. The composability then is needed to make that useful, but it is more the localization of the data requirements with the thing that needs them.
Yeah, I
No.
guess to that point, I also maybe this is cowardice. I avoided it because I think the granularity of the componentization is like somewhat debatable. So I think in Relay, like they go with like components, but I think like, you know, if you took it to its logical extreme, it's like it should be like, yeah, like every access corresponds to like an exact line in your GraphQL, and it could be a function, it could be even more granular than that. Which is why I also conveniently maybe de-emphasize that point. But I agree that, yeah, like maybe that's the more important part than the composability itself.
Noted. Yeah, that's a good point. All right. Thank you, Jeanette. This is a good change. Martine, I'm going to hand it to you for the next two agenda items. You want to talk about release trains?
Trains, yes. We've released a spec in September. Yay. After 4 years of not releasing a spec. And at GraphQL Conf, the idea was floated to do, I don't know, I call them release trains, but it's something like having a fixed schedule for releases. Let's say every year or every year before GraphQL Conf or something like this. So I just wanted to like make a vibe check what everyone here thinks. Should we commit to that? Yeah, that's it. I've opened an issue. I can link it there. I don't know if it needs to be an RFC or if it needs to be written somewhere. Maybe we want to keep room for reverting the decision. But if we want to do this, I think giving visibility to the community that we are going to do a release before next GraphQL Conf is going to help a lot.
I think we should. I think what will probably be most helpful is one, agreeing on the schedule, and annual sounds good, and aiming for September seems also good. That will get us ballpark near conferences that happen. I noticed in the thread there was some conversation about conference dates may change around, and that's true. Um, and historically, we've tried to like line up spec cuts with various things that are happening, and in my opinion, that ends up being more work than it actually ends up being worth, because if the spec cut happens a few months before a conference, then I don't know, you got a couple months worth of like conference material building to do. And it's probably more important that it happens than it like happens perfectly at this day. Um, so giving us a schedule will help a lot because that gives us an expectation, and then publicly sharing it will also help as a commitment device. Probably the most important thing is just the TSC keeping us on task to make sure these happen. Like they end up being a fairly large amount of work to make sure that we've like combed through, are there any remaining open PRs that need to get closed? Which ones are like on the train? And I think this year we, like a couple months before the spec cut, decided that we were going to have that finished before the conference. And it took, I think, at least one full month longer than we thought it would take. Um, and so probably the most effective thing we can do is preemptively insert agenda items into upcoming meetings in probably like, release date minus 1, 2, and 3 months, at a minimum, just to like keep ourselves aware of the thing that we said we were going to do. So that when we say, hey, it's coming in 3 months, that's a good sign that we should start evaluating what PRs we want to like put pressure on to finish. 2 months is like we're wrapping up editorial review, minus 1 month means we're like finishing the last final touches before we do the cut. Um, that's my just like riffing what I think will work. And maybe there's a way we can build it into because since Benji's written a pretty cool tool that auto generates the agenda files, maybe we can add it into that. Does that seem like a reasonable thing to do?
Yeah, it's really easy to just add it to that. That's what the TSC alert in this one was, I think. It's just an automated this time of year thing. Um, I am generally on board with this. Like I was the one pushing for a cut this time, and I think having cuts more frequently is valuable. Um, I I'm happy with the idea of doing it at a regular time because it's easy to automate the parts around it. But I would also say that it does mean that we're gonna have some frustration because X feature or Y feature that's almost done needs to avoid the cut. So just so that we've covered the eventualities, I think the alternative that I would propose is that we set a goal each year, whether it be just in time for the conference or whether it be in time for September or whatever. And then we also set a hard deadline. And my hard deadline, I think, should be either 18 or 24 months. If it has been 24 months since the last spec cut, we will do a spec cut with whatever is on main at that time. And that will go ahead, essentially. So that would be the alternative that I would propose. But at the moment, I am leaning towards Martin's idea of essentially just having September be the date and we just tie it into the schedules and everything just works because it's automated. So yeah, that's my thoughts.
Yeah, my sense is that we've been doing the aim for a big feature land plus timeout. Some, even if we haven't written it down, that's like roughly what we've been doing. And it turns out that we just, as soon as one thing is done, there's another big thing on the horizon, and we want to get that thing into. And it's that this is, I think, probably the reason why release trains were invented was just keep people from doing this. So the thing that I like about the release trains is the trains always run on time, and then the scheduling pressure shifts from when are we going to do the release to when is this feature going to land? Because if we can get the all of the RFC work done for something that we're excited about before the release train, then it gets to go in. And if you miss it, then you have to wait for the next one. Um, and also like the kind of nice thing about this being at the spec layer is we tend to adopt functionality when it lands in draft in most clients and services, as opposed to waiting until it enters an official release. So the releases are important. There's like a lot of properties they have that are very valuable, but they aren't the panacea that unlocks the ability for things to happen in the community, which means like, if we landed a huge feature this month in November, and the next spec cut isn't until next year, September. What are we going to do between now and then? It's like probably implement it in all of our clients and services and start using it. And so that makes me like less nervous. Otherwise, if the release train was more load bearing, or if our releases in general were more load bearing, then I would suggest a faster cadence, like doing them twice annually or even faster than that. Like a good counter example there is Node.js, which has very sophisticated release trains that have a decently fast cadence to them, where every couple of months they're running a new release train, and they need to do that to get the development work out to people. Um, we should probably be considering that for GraphQL JS, but the spec itself, I don't think we need to be that aggressive. So,
Um,
yeah, pro on release trains.
yeah, I think we've all agreed on release trains. Fantastic. So logistics wise, should we make it so that on the relevant date, effectively we create a branch off of main that is essentially the release train, and then we've got like a month or two for editorial, and then that goes somewhere else. Like because what I don't want to do is freeze the spec for a month or 2 months whilst we're trying to progress those things. We want to be able to keep other things going in parallel. So yeah, I'm just trying to think through the logistics of that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Lee?
Um, my sense is that we keep that as a option in our pocket should the need call for it. historically we have not needed to do that. I think you need to do release branches in a couple scenarios. You either need to do them when you have overlapping release trains. So you want one release train to be stably working towards its release while another one is getting up and running, and those all then need to coexist. So you need them to be in their own release branches. Or where you don't trust the stability of the main branch and you need to then pull a release branch so you can diverge from the main branch when you find things worth fixing. Um, we don't have to worry about overlapping release trains. And I think it is unlikely that we have to worry about an unstable main branch. There's, of course, continuously things that we find and fix in editorial, but that tends to be most of the work of the couple of months leading up to the spec cut anyway, is like digging through everything and polishing them. Um, and if there's ever a scenario where we say, hey, this thing is done and ready to merge, but the only reason we're not going to merge it is because it's actually probably not quite done and we're trying to get ready for a release, then I don't know, like we'll deal with that situation if it pops up. And if it does, a release branch is one of our options, and we'll probably have other options too. So anyway, my opinion is to err on the side of minimal process, and the side of minimal process says do everything in the main branch and then keep our options open if that won't work for us when the day comes.
Okay, so it just means that essentially people with merge rights need to be very aware that they're merging during that time period.
Yeah. And so I think probably process-wise, the thing that'll be most helpful is inserting this like T minus 3 months, 2 months, and 1 months into our agenda. Because that will mean that it will be we'll be very aware. And that's essentially what we did manually this time around, is we just made a lot of noise about the upcoming release cut, and that kept us accountable for making progress. And it worked. So if we automate it, then hopefully we'll do it every year.
Sounds great. So there's one remaining question, which is when is the train arriving? And I imagine September to match last year would this year would make sense.
I don't have strong opinions, but that seems quite reasonable to me. Kind of a nice thing about that is it kind of overlaps a 2 to 3 month window of time, which is not overlapping major holidays. And, we sort of like get started. That T minus 3 months is right as the summer holidays are starting to wrap. Or I guess T minus 3 months is in the middle of summer holidays, but T minus 2 months is as some summer holidays are wrapping up.
Cool. Sounds good to me.
Which I do remember as part of because originally we wanted to do it in July, late July, I think, and then we realized trying to finalize the spec cut while in the midst of summer holidays was just not going to happen.
Summer holidays ends at the very beginning of September in the UK, just FYI.
Oh, it does. Okay. Well, ours are a little earlier than that, but
do we want to open an issue to keep track of this? Last time, Benji, you had an issue with a list of important pull requests to put in the release. This was cool. I liked it. Should we keep that process, or do we want to do things differently?
I think the list, if I'm thinking of the right list, like the one with like 40 different items in it, that was actually a list of things that had been merged rather than should be merged, I think.
Yes, yes. But it's still good. It's good information. Like it gives a good overview of what's in the release.
Well, if I put the time in, and I've got a lot of other things on my plate right now, maybe we can tie that into the Foundation's official RFC tracker when we get it, and essentially have a live list of here's what's going to be going out in the next cut. That might be the best way of doing that.
Cool.
All right. We got a plan. We'll keep the trains rolling. Martine, the next one's yours as well. You want to talk about capabilities?
Yes, I have slides. Wait, where are the slides? Yeah, I'll keep it quick. I wanted to talk about nullability, but you saw me coming. This is really about nullability. I'll make it real quick. How do we? Yes. We've made a lot of work, like we've done a long way. The first mention of nullability I found was in April 2021 by Alex Rayleigh from Yelp. I'm sure there were discussions before. It's been more than 4 years now. And well, I think we have never been closer to the finish line. So let's get to the finish line. And to get to the finish line, we need capabilities. So yeah, I forgot to, I'm not doing the whole story again about true nullability and the type system and everything. We realize what we really need is a way to disable null bubbling. And in order to do that, we need a way to know if a server supports disabling null bubbling and what is the default for that value, which is through capabilities. And we also realize that service capabilities are useful in a lot of other places, so it would make sense to focus on them right now. And Benji made this nice pull request here with everything. I can actually copy paste it in chat if I find the chat here, which I encourage you to review, but I have a few slides to like go through the main points of capabilities. So what are capabilities? And Benji, please stop me if I say something completely wrong or stupid, but my current understanding is it's SDL. I mean, it's a new block in your SDL that describes your service, and that service has a bunch of capabilities. For now, it's only capabilities, but in the future, we could add more things to a service. And every capability is a qualified name. So what's a qualified name? It's a bunch of names with a dot. Name started with GraphQL would be reserved for us, like for official spec features. So this here, for an example, it's on error means this server has support for the on error request parameter. Capabilities can also have arguments in the shape of strings. So here we can say the default error behavior is null, which is maybe, we're going to talk about that later, but maybe the more modern default. And it can be used, so this is the tools that are going to be used for error handling, but you can use them for like anything, like if you want fragment arguments, or maybe defer stream for Rob a bit later, that can be also put inside capabilities. So it's not limited to errors. Capabilities support introspection. Obviously, it's actually pretty simple. I was amazed at how simple the type system is here. Just a meta field service at the top level. The service has a bunch of capabilities. Basically mimics what's in SDL, and each capability has identifier, description, and value. This way, your client, if it's smart enough, can send the good on error value. What's the good on error value? You have basically three choices. So this is not capabilities anymore. This is enabled by capabilities. We can now start sending this on error request parameter. Current default is propagate. So with a schema, very simple schema, two fields, non-null, you request two fields. If you have an error on foo here, for an example, the error bubbles and you get a null data. So this is the current thing, which is bad because if you have something in bar, then it's lost forever, like you've lost that. New one would be null. Now you have something in bar, you can see that here. So you're not losing that anymore. And if the client is smart enough, you can pass the errors array to know that this null here, even though it's non-nullable, it's an error null, so it's okay to put null here. And there is a last one, which is halt, which I like to call the eco-friendly one. It saves CPU cycles on your server because if your client doesn't care about partial data, your server can stop processing the response on the first error, so there's no need to resolve all those fields. So I don't know, I do not expect this one to be as used as the other ones, but it's still a cool one to have for the planet and for servers around. What do we need? So we have spec edits from Benji. Thank you a lot, Benji. So if you haven't already, please review pull request number 1133. We need a GraphQL JS implementation. So if someone here feels strongly about TypeScript, that's definitely an area that could have some help. Other languages, Java, Kotlin, Swift, would also Golang, Ruby, all of them would need implementations. Maybe we can start with GraphQL JS, like just to validate everything. But if you have an implementation in another language, it's also useful to investigate this. What we really need is real-life use cases. So if you have an app, try enabling it. That's also very good feedback. And maybe more short term for this group, I have one question, which is, should we should we separate this pull request in two, like one for capabilities and one for on errors? Like they are both linked. Like on error is a very strong case for capabilities, but maybe we want to review them differently if this is easier. And then we can all be happy. Uh, the nullability working group is not meeting anymore. Like I think not because there is no interest anymore, but just because feels like everyone agrees that this is the way we want to proceed with. We've canceled the last two meetings of 2025 for the nullability working group. So yeah, just let's get this going. That's all I have.
You're muted, Lee.
Oh, I'm muted. What are our current open questions with the capabilities approach?
Syntax.
I mean, there was a back and forth with Michael already. Like this has gone through a round of reviews already, right?
Yes, I'm not sure where that landed up though. It would be great if Michael was here, but he's not on the call at the moment. But yeah, essentially, I wasn't proposing that we even start this with a syntax, but the composite schemas working group are like, we want this thing. We really, really, really want this thing. This is a thing that we need and have needed for a while, and we need a syntax for it. So they've effectively put syntax as a requirement for it, which is fair. We should definitely have an idea of what we want to do with regard to the syntax, even if we don't actually implement the syntax to start with. What I have here is like a proposed first version of the syntax. One of the Lee's pointed out already that this introduces periods to the SDL. There's a number of oddities around this. One is that the value is optional. So like many of the things that we want to indicate are just presence of a thing. So for example, operation descriptions, either we syntactically support them or we don't. If you send a GraphQL query that doesn't support operation descriptions to a server that doesn't support it, it's just going to throw you a syntax error. So it'd be good to know that ahead of time, whether it supports that. And that's just a yes or no. Do I support that thing? And if you know of the existence of the key, then you know of the feature and you should support it, essentially. But for some things, like the indication of what your default mode is for something, then having a value is important. And trying to indicate that through a series of Boolean settings is not ideal. So there, it's a little bit weird having a syntax for that. Maybe curly braces isn't right. Maybe colons isn't right. I do think that the periods are correct though. But yeah.
Cool. Okay. So the plan is exists in introspection, exists in SDL. Do we need any sort of back compatibility support for this? As introspection, you sort of get that for free, right? Like you need to be able to know what to query in order to get it from the introspection.
Yeah, you get it for free with introspection, and with the SDL, I think we would default to printing without the service details. And you would opt into also printing the service details.
Okay, so that gives people the ability to upgrade to the latest versions of these things while printing schemas that work with the rest of their ecosystem. And only once the rest of the ecosystem supports the grammar, then we can turn it on everywhere.
Yeah, I think one of the really important things to note about that, and like one of the reasons behind it that people might not immediately get, is that the service capabilities indicate the capabilities of the service, whereas the SDL broadly indicates the type system. So tools like code type generation, they mostly care about the type system, whereas what like linting might care about the service capabilities. Like, can I send a document that has these comments in to the server? Can I send a document that has fragment arguments in it to the server? That's not so much a type thing in the user's code as like, do I need to compile this away on the client perspective effectively? And I think that this is actually something that clients such as Apollo client or clients that don't have schema knowledge may want to actually issue these parts of introspection at runtime to say, hey, how much work do I need to do as a client to compile away fragment arguments, for example, before sending them to a server? And just to expand even further, one of the things that I would really like to get out of this is essentially like a zero config version of GraphQL, where you just say, here's my GraphQL endpoint, and you feed it into your client, and your client discovers from the endpoint itself what that endpoint is actually capable of. So that's my longer term vision for it as well.
That makes sense. And then I can't remember exactly where we landed on how to use this to unlock the nullability thing, but I imagine that there's something important we need to do in terms of expressing the capability, the client's doing the right thing, in order to unlock the rest.
Yeah, go on.
No, it's really the default value of the error mode. Like if we don't want every client to send on error for the rest of the world until the end of time, we need server to ship with the default value that is not propagate, and we need client to know that default value.
There's that, and there's also the concern of whether or not the server can even accept the key on error.
Yes.
Like it can send that, but if it gets an error back, that error coming back doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't support it. It could be some other thing. It could be that you're using trusted documents and it's not an allowed query. It could be any number of things.
Because there's plenty of services that will blindly ignore unknown additional parameters in the request, right? So you just like you send it with on error, it just ignores that since it's not part of the API spec. And then you think you're getting some behavior and you're not actually getting that behavior.
And that is actually a behavior that we now specify in the GraphQL over HTTP spec. We tell you if there's additional keys that you don't understand, ignore them. It's essentially a promise that any client should be able to send any future capable thing and have it just assume that it's going to fall back safely.
Yep, which is what we want. Yeah, we wouldn't want the server to start blowing up because you sent that. Okay, cool. This is a good plan. So you've got call to actions for all the things that we need. I'm gonna go through and do one round of review on this particular spec PR. But it looks like building this out in GraphQL.js is probably the most important next piece, right?
Yeah, most probably. So if you have strong objection, like let us know soonish.
My previous argument on this front was that we should launch service capabilities with something that needs it, and up until now there hadn't, or up until recently there hadn't been anything that needed it. It'd be kind of pointless launching it on its own without it actually doing something. However, we now have a thing which is operation descriptions. So I am happy now to split service capabilities up and introduce them now as a feature on its own that just does the server support operation descriptions or not? And then stack the error behaviors pull request on top of that. So that answers the other question that you had, Martin.
Sounds like a plan.
I do have one question. And I wanted to ask this in the RFC, but it came up like Apollo client should maybe always send something like this at runtime. The big problem that we would have with that is that most people in production turn off introspection, and this is defined as an introspection field. So if the spec doesn't say that this should never be able to be turned off, people will turn it off and everything will break down. So should the spec have
It's
an addition here, like service capabilities cannot be turned off like other introspection features or something like that?
it can be turned off. It's not a problem. Yeah, it's not needed at runtime.
Well,
You
but Benji just suggested it would be.
I've
Oh,
suggested
sorry, I
you
missed that.
can use it at runtime, but in the case
Oh,
of
okay.
like essentially, like as I mentioned before, this is targeting kind of a zero config. And if you turn off introspection at runtime, then you don't get the zero config. Now you need to tell your Apollo command line or whatever, here's my endpoint, and it will read the service capabilities and it will then write out a config file that says we can use fragment arguments, we can't use operation descriptions, we can use the on error field, we can't use this other thing. And it's just a bunch of Booleans in your client. And those are then fixed for the lifetime of that client. Whereas if you were doing it at runtime, each time the client booted up, you'd be able to say, oh, all of a sudden my service supports fragment arguments. Fantastic. I'll start using them. So yeah, it's okay for it to be disabled. But also, importantly, this is a separate entry point. It's Dunder service. So most people at the moment block Dunder schema and Dunder type because they don't block Dunder type name. So this is
I
again
have
another
seen
key.
people block underscore underscore type name
Yeah.
actually in the wild,
Yeah.
which is a big problem. And that's kind of why I bring this up. If we don't write in the spec that people aren't allowed to block it, they will block it. And if one day we get a capability that we need to evaluate at runtime, we will be in a situation then that half the ecosystem doesn't deliver them. And we have like allowed for that. And then we have a capability that needs to be queried at runtime. So
Yeah.
the question is like, should we maybe do that from the start? Just write in there, this one should not be turned off by security features.
I don't think we should do that because there's definitely security concerns that would come from it. Like you probably don't want, if you're a first party, not a third party API, like your Instagram's internal API, then the only party who should ever be able to observe the capabilities of your API are first party Instagram developers. And so if you have your publicly served API and you say you're not technically GraphQL unless you're also publicly serving the capabilities of that API, is probably not what you want. Like that would break the security guarantee.
Wouldn't that be like a trusted documents thing? Like that introspection query would also be a trusted query.
The Probably, but I don't believe there are any examples of in those scenarios where they're doing runtime introspection. They're probably doing it entirely as part of their build tooling, developer tooling, and the trusted documents for product level queries are getting saved and then used at runtime and not for introspection. But certainly that's up to each, but that's kind of the point, right? Is that like each service is open to do whatever is appropriate for their security um, needs. And I don't see, obviously, developer tooling breaks if you turn these things off. But if your expectation is, I do not want anyone to be able to use developer tooling on the public version of this API, that seems reasonable to me. So we should not block that. But we should just make it clear that by blocking it, you will disable the ability to use developer tooling. But I guess the line in the sand is which of these things are expected to be exclusively powering developer tools, and which of them are required to run production tools, not developer tools. I think
That's my
double
point.
underscore, yeah, double underscore type name is a place where that's been in a gray area, where I think if we were able to rewind 10 years and redo some things, we probably would have introduced double underscore key or like something that allowed us to not rely on that one because it does leak, like internal product names. Like you have to be really careful about what you name your types because they end up being publicly observable, which may or may not be what you want from a like product security point of view. But that's kind of the bed we've made ourselves. So in general, yeah, we should be thinking about like are these things required for runtime? And if it's in a security envelope, we should be thinking about how can we make this not required for runtime? Which I think we have in this case, right? That the service capabilities define, like, as long as if you want to block it in production, that just means then you need to be able to read it before you're in production so that when you are in production, you're using the same saved capabilities that you got while you were in development time.
Yeah, that's accurate. And also there are things that you might change in capabilities that would be a breaking change. So for example, if you were to change what the default error behavior of your schema is, that's a breaking change. So you just would not be able to make that change. Or at least you'd need a v2 of your schema to do so, and that's okay. That's a trade-off that we're okay with, I think. But essentially, it means that if you do introspection of those capabilities at any point in time, and then you cache that forever, that's fine. That'll be fine. Just means you can't make use of any newer features that are added, and there shouldn't be anything added to capabilities. You are free to add what capabilities to your schema you want to add. This is one of the other features of this, like add other stuff if you want to. But for us as the spec, we should never add anything to the spec that requires this to be run at runtime. I'd also like to say my customary, if you are disabling introspection in production, there's a very, very strong chance that you're doing the wrong thing and you should be using trusted documents instead.
We'd be upset if you didn't remind us of that, Benji. All right. Very exciting. Okay, Martin, keep making noise about what you need for the rest of getting capabilities over the line. I agree with you that I think this is the last link in the chain in order to get this many years long episode of Nullability to its finish line.
We'll get there.
Okay, we have a few minutes left, which is hopefully what we need for Rob to give us an update on defer and stream.
Yeah, I just want to call attention to this PR of spec edits for the response section. This is targeting an integration branch that I've had running for a while. The integration branch now has recently merged changes for the section 3, which describes the defer and stream directives. So this is now for section 7, the response section, and also adds an appendix of examples. Building on work that we did over the past bunch of months on really adding concrete names for all the existing response types. Now we're building on that, adding what we need for incremental delivery, an incremental stream, describing in detail what objects are returned in that stream, what all the properties are. Yeah, so looking to get feedback on this, and then we can move on to the next section. Yep, and then that's it.
All right. Let that be a bit of a call to action to TSC folks. I see a couple people have already jumped in and done some review. So I'll try to jump in and do some more. Excited to see an appendix just full of examples. I think that's a pretty cool idea. This is going to be a big
not
change
sure
too.
how. Yeah. And not sure how detailed I wanted to get on the appendix. So if you have ideas of more examples we should put, if you think this is too many, definitely let me know.
There is so many subtleties in this. I don't think that having too many is really going to be a concern. I think this is actually going to be quite useful as a source of a test suite for people that are implementing this, which is really what the examples are there for. So yeah, I think more is generally better unless they are truly redundant.
Yeah, happy to keep building on it.
Of course, we can build a test suite out somewhere else if we need to, if it does get unwieldy.
We would love to do that at some point. Remember our plan to build GraphQL cats at some point. Would love to build GraphQL cats. Compliance acceptance tests. All right. We've gotten to the bottom of our agenda and right on time. Anything else we need to cover before we wrap?
I made one comment in the chat that people may not have picked up on, and that is that for the new service type that was proposed, I would like to introduce a new entry point to the schema from there to standardize our include deprecated. Because at the moment, the way that include deprecated works is on a per field basis, and it's not consistent. And really, you should have a true form of the schema with everything included and a undeprecated form of the schema with all the deprecated things removed, and those are the only two versions that you should see. You shouldn't be able to see a mishmash of them. So I just want to make people aware of that, because in particular for the security topic, if you are going to say, for example, you always want to allow Dunder service, in future that may allow access to Dunder service.schema, which then gives you an entry point to the rest of your introspection.
Super interesting. Yeah, I think that deserves its own standalone RFC, but I really agree that we screwed this one up in the first place, that rather than thinking about it as a property of the fields on an object type, we should have thought about it as you are getting one of two schemas, the full schema with all the deprecated stuff in it, or the valid subset schema with all the deprecated stuff removed. And doing it on a field by field basis is weird and not quite right. So looking forward to seeing any progress you make on that one if possible. All right, friends, we've come to the end of our time. Thanks for digging through all this stuff together. Lots of really awesome work, and we've got more to do. Thanks, y'all. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Catch you
Appreciate
next
it.
time. Bye.
Thanks you.
See you.